He invited his ex-wife to mourn a dead man, then used her silence as entertainment. Grace Whitmore stepped through the front doors of the lake house just after 4 in the afternoon, when the Connecticut sky had turned the color of wet silver and the last guests were shaking rain from black umbrellas onto the marble floor. The house had not changed. The same crystal chandelier hung above the foyer, scattering pale light over the carved staircase. The same family portraits watched from dark wood walls. The same grand piano sat near the windows facing the lake, polished so perfectly it looked untouched by grief. Only Arthur Whitmore was missing. His photograph stood above the fireplace in the great room, framed in white roses, his blue eyes caught forever in the soft patience Grace remembered too well. She paused there for one breath, holding a folded handkerchief in her gloved hand, the old cotton worn thin at the corners. Arthur had carried it through hospital rooms, board meetings, and Sunday breakfasts. He had pressed it into her palm once and told her that quiet people noticed what loud people destroyed. Across the room, Ethan saw her. Her ex-husband stood near the mantel in a black tailored suit that fit him like a public image. Beside him was Vanessa Cole, diamond earrings flashing beneath her smooth blonde hair, one hand resting on Ethan's sleeve as if she had already inherited the room. Ethan's smile arrived slowly, not with warmth, but with recognition sharpened into a blade. He lifted his glass of water just high enough for nearby relatives to notice. "Grace," he said, his voice carrying easily beneath the chandelier. "You always did know when money was in the room." A few people looked down. A few did not. Someone near the windows released a small, careful laugh, the kind wealthy families use when cruelty is dressed well enough to pass as wit. Grace did not answer. She only lowered her eyes to Arthur's photograph, as if Ethan had spoken from very far away. Vanessa tilted her head, studying Grace's plain black coat, her simple pearl earrings, the absence of any man beside her. "I'm surprised you came," Vanessa said softly, but not softly enough. "Some women never know when the story is over." Ethan's mouth curved. "Let her stay," he said. Arthur was charitable to everyone. The room settled into an uncomfortable silence. Grace could feel the eyes on her, measuring her coat, her empty hands, the years since the divorce. 3 years ago, she had walked out of this house with 2 suitcases and a cardboard box of books, while Ethan told her she was too small for the life he was stepping into. Now he stood in that life, surrounded by polished silver trays, tall windows, expensive grief, and people waiting to see whether she would break. She did not. When the housekeeper moved to guide her toward the front chairs, Ethan raised one hand. "Family in front," he said. "Grace can sit anywhere else." The housekeeper froze. Grace gave the woman a gentle nod, then walked to the back row by herself. Her heels made no dramatic sound on the rug. Her posture stayed straight. Her hands folded over Arthur's handkerchief as though it were something sacred, not something old. Ethan watched her sit and mistook her composure for defeat. Vanessa leaned closer to him, satisfied. Then the double doors opened again. Margaret Hale, Arthur's longtime attorney, entered with a brown leather briefcase pressed against her side. She did not greet Ethan first. She looked past him, past the roses, past the rows of Whitmores waiting to be rewarded, and her eyes found Grace in the back. For one brief second, the lawyer lowered her chin in quiet respect. Grace's fingers tightened around the handkerchief. Ethan did not notice. He was still smiling when Margaret placed the briefcase on the mahogany table. The small brass lock clicked open, and somehow that tiny sound traveled farther than every insult in the room. Margaret Hale removed a cream-colored envelope from the briefcase and laid it flat on the table, but she did not open it yet. She waited for the final relatives to settle, for the whispers to fade, for the house to remember what kind of room it had become. Ethan remained near the fireplace, one hand in his pocket, his shoulder angled toward Vanessa, as if the two of them were already the center of the Whitmore name. Vanessa stood close, enough for her diamond ring to catch the light every time she moved. It was new, almost too bright for a room dressed in mourning, a hard white sparkle against black silk. Grace kept her eyes on Arthur's photograph. In the picture, he had been standing on the dock behind the house, wearing a navy sweater and the same gentle half-smile he had given her the first morning she brought him coffee without being asked. That had been 5 years earlier, long before the divorce, when the lake house still smelled of cedar, old paper, and the cinnamon rolls Grace baked on Sundays because Arthur said store-bought pastry tasted like cardboard with frosting. Back then, Ethan was rarely home before midnight. He was always at a dinner in Manhattan, a conference in Chicago, a private meeting in Boston, building a future he described in numbers Grace could repeat but never feel invited into. Arthur noticed more than he said. He noticed when Grace set his medication beside a glass of water before his nurse arrived. He noticed when she moved rugs away from the hallway because his steps had grown uncertain. He noticed when she sat with him during long afternoons while rain tapped against the lake windows and read aloud from the financial pages. Even though she had once wanted to open a small design studio instead of learning the language of stocks, trusts, and board votes. Grace had never called it sacrifice. She had simply done what needed doing, the way some people close a window before a storm reaches the carpet. In the great room, Clara Whitmore dabbed at the corner of her eye with a linen tissue, but her gaze kept drifting toward Ethan, not Arthur's portrait. Clara had always believed the family belonged to her son by nature, by blood, by the invisible rules that old houses seemed to whisper through their walls. When Grace had been married to Ethan, Clara introduced her at charity luncheons with a polite smile and a careful distance, as though Grace were a temporary guest who had misplaced her departure date. Vanessa did not make that mistake. She behaved as if Grace had already been erased. She crossed the room slowly, stopping near the back row where Grace sat alone. "You must feel strange being here," Vanessa said, her voice wrapped in sympathy so thin it nearly tore. "After all, this is a family matter." Grace looked up at her. Not sharply, not defensively, just enough for Vanessa to see that the words had landed and found no place to stay. "Arthur asked me to come," Grace said. It was the first sentence she had spoken since entering the house. Quiet, clear, almost plain. Vanessa's smile tightened. Arthur was sentimental at the end. From the fireplace, Ethan gave a short breath of amusement, as if that explained everything. Grace lowered her gaze again to the handkerchief in her lap. She remembered Arthur in his study, thinner by then, his wedding ring loose on his finger, his voice tired but steady when he told her, "Sentiment is what people call loyalty when they have never had to earn it." Margaret Hale finally broke the silence. "We can begin," she said, and every face turned toward the unopened envelope, except Grace's. Grace was still looking at Arthur's photograph because she already knew the dead sometimes kept their promises better than the living. Margaret's words should have quieted the room, but Ethan had never understood the kind of silence that deserved respect. He stepped away from the fireplace before the attorney could break the seal, smoothing one cuff beneath his jacket sleeve with the practiced calm of a man used to being watched. "Before we begin," he said, "I think we should be clear about why everyone is here." Margaret looked at him over her reading glasses, patient but unmoved. Clara lowered her tissue. Vanessa's smile returned, faint and polished. Ethan turned slightly, allowing his gaze to find Grace in the back row as if he had saved his final courtesy for her. "My father was generous," he said. "Sometimes too generous. He kept old attachments longer than necessary." A few relatives shifted in their seats. The lake beyond the tall windows lay gray beneath the rain, the dock barely visible through the mist. Grace sat with Arthur's handkerchief folded between her palms, feeling the worn cotton press into her skin. "Grace was part of this family once," Ethan continued, "and I understand why she might feel entitled to witness this moment. But today is about the Whitmore legacy, not about reopening a chapter that ended years ago." He did not raise his voice. That made it worse. Every word arrived dressed as manners. Every insult polished enough to pass through the room without anyone having to call it cruel. Vanessa glanced toward Grace with a small expression of pity, the kind given from a safe balcony to someone standing in the rain. "Of course," Vanessa said. "No one wants this to become uncomfortable." Grace lifted her eyes. For a moment, all she heard was the old house breathing around her. The soft hum of the heating vents, the faint tick of the mantel clock, the far-off sound of rain slipping down copper gutters. She remembered the same clock at 2 in the morning, when Arthur could not sleep and had asked her to sit with him in the study. Ethan had been in Los Angeles that week. Clara had sent flowers from Palm Beach. Vanessa had not existed in their lives yet. Grace had made tea in a blue mug with a chipped handle and listened while Arthur talked about the first hardware store his father opened 40 miles inland. Before the Whitmore name had offices, foundations, lake houses, and people who confused inheritance with worth. Money is loud when it is insecure, Arthur had told her. Character is quiet because it does not need permission. Now Ethan stood beneath Arthur's portrait and mistook the room for his stage. If you are hoping for some public gesture, he said to Grace, I would rather spare you the disappointment. The sentence fell gently, but its meaning landed hard. Someone near the piano looked away. The housekeeper, still standing by the doorway, pressed her lips together. Grace did not defend herself. She did not remind them of hospital corridors, unpaid hours, tax files she had organized, or the winter morning Arthur had signed forms with a trembling hand while she steadied the page for him. She only smoothed the handkerchief once across her lap. Margaret's gaze moved from Ethan to Grace, and something in her expression cooled. Mr. Whitmore, the attorney said, your father left instructions that Mrs. Grace Whitmore remain present for the full reading. Ethan's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Vanessa blinked. Clara's tissue stopped halfway to her cheek. Grace looked down, not in shame, but to hide the smallest breath leaving her body. Ethan gave a short, careful laugh. Fine, he said. Let her listen. Margaret placed one finger beneath the envelope flap. The paper opened with a dry whisper, and the room leaned toward it as if the dead man had just drawn breath. Margaret began with the formal language Arthur had chosen, words about sound mind, lawful intent, and the stewardship of a name older than anyone in the room wanted to admit. But as her voice moved across the paper, Grace felt the room loosen from the present and pull her backward, past the rain on the windows, past Ethan's polished shoes near the fireplace, back to the night her marriage ended under brighter lights. It had been 3 years earlier, after the Whitmore Foundation Gala at a hotel in Midtown Manhattan, 30 stories above streets glittering with taxi lights and wet pavement. Grace had worn a navy dress Ethan approved because it was quiet enough not to embarrass him, and pearl earrings Arthur had given her because he said elegance did not need to sparkle to be real. All evening, Ethan had moved through the ballroom without her, shaking hands with donors, laughing beside executives, accepting congratulations for a charity campaign Grace had spent 6 months organizing from their dining room table. She had corrected donor lists at 2 in the morning, negotiated catering costs, written thank you notes by hand, because Arthur believed gratitude should have ink on it. But when a photographer asked Ethan to bring his wife into the picture, he glanced around as if searching for someone more suitable. Vanessa Cole was not his fiancée then. She was a consultant in a silver-gray dress, standing near the auction display with a tablet in her hand and confidence sharpened into beauty. Ethan asked her into the frame instead. Grace saw the choice before anyone explained it. Later, in the private elevator going down, the city sliding past in streaks of gold and black glass, Ethan finally said what his posture had been saying for months. You are a good woman, Grace, he told her, looking at his reflection instead of her face. But you are too small for the life I am stepping into. The elevator hummed. Her wedding ring felt suddenly heavy, not because it was large, but because it had become the last person in the elevator still pretending. She did not cry in front of him. She did not ask who had made him feel so tall. She only watched the floor numbers descend until the doors opened into the lobby and cold air rolled in from the revolving entrance. By midnight, she was back at the lake house packing 2 suitcases and 1 cardboard box. She took her books, her winter coat, the framed photograph of her mother, and the small blue notebook where she had written Arthur's medication schedule. Ethan stood at the bedroom door, phone glowing in his hand, irritated that she was leaving without a scene. You do not have to make this dramatic, he said. Grace folded a sweater and placed it on top of the books. I am not. Outside, rain tapped against the roof, steady and unbothered. Clara did not come downstairs. The staff had gone home. The house that had once held her footsteps now watched her like a museum closing for the night. She drove 40 miles to a small apartment above a bakery in New Haven, where the heat clicked loudly in the walls and the kitchen window faced a brick building close enough to touch. At 7 the next morning, before the bakery opened, her phone rang. Arthur's name appeared on the screen. His voice was rough with age and something quieter than anger. Grace, he said, did my son let you leave with dignity? She stood barefoot on the cold floor, looking at the boxes stacked beside the stove. For the first time since the elevator, her eyes burned. I left with it, she answered. There was a long pause. Then Arthur said, Good. Keep it. People will try to charge you rent for a place you already own inside yourself. In the great room, Margaret's voice brought Grace back. Ethan was listening now with his chin slightly raised, still believing the past had been settled because he had named it over. Grace looked at the unopened weight of the remaining pages in Margaret's hand and understood that some doors did not close loudly. Some waited, locked from the other side, until the right key touched the table. Margaret read the first pages slowly, and every legal sentence seemed to make Ethan more comfortable, because the beginning sounded exactly the way he expected a rich man's will to sound. There were charitable gifts, instructions for staff bonuses, careful notes about art, watches, and family photographs. Ethan stood with the calm patience of someone waiting for the inevitable arrival of his own name. But Grace heard something else beneath the words. She heard the scratch of Arthur's fountain pen in the study 6 months earlier, when the fire had burned low and the lake outside had frozen at the edges. He had called her on a Tuesday evening, asking if she could stop by for an hour. She had almost said no. By then, she had rebuilt a small life in New Haven, 3 rooms above the bakery, a second-hand desk near the window, mornings that smelled of coffee and warm bread instead of polished wood and family expectation. She worked with older clients who needed help organizing medical appointments, household records, and the quiet messes families left behind when pride made simple things complicated. Arthur had become one of those clients at first. Then, slowly, he became something older and rarer, a witness. That winter evening, he sat behind his desk with a blanket over his knees and several folders stacked beside a silver desk lamp. "I need your eyes," he told her. "Not your loyalty to me. Your honesty." Grace removed her coat, folded it over the chair, and sat across from him. The papers were not sentimental. Bank statements, foundation reports, vendor contracts, reimbursement records, board approvals. Numbers lined the pages in neat black columns. But there were places where the neatness had begun to crack. A consulting fee paid twice. A donation routed through a company Grace had never heard of. A transfer approved on a day Ethan had claimed to be out of the country. Vanessa's signature appeared on several advisory memos, elegant and sharp, always near the margins where responsibility could pretend to be distance. Grace did not accuse anyone. She only asked questions and wrote down answers. Arthur watched her work for nearly 2 hours without interrupting. When she reached the final folder, she found a proposed sale agreement for the lake house property, drafted but unsigned, with Ethan's initials marked on a yellow tab. The price was high, too high to be about need, too hurried to be about legacy. Arthur looked toward the dark windows, where the reflection of his own house trembled faintly in the glass. "He wants to sell it before the audit finds the holes," he said. His voice did not break. It simply became smaller. Grace closed the folder with both hands. "You should speak to your attorney." Arthur smiled without joy. "I am speaking to the person who still knows how to tell the truth without enjoying the damage." She could have used those papers. She could have mailed copies to every board member, every donor, every society page that had once cropped her out of photographs. Instead, she placed each document back into order, clipped the receipts together, and pushed the stack toward him. "Revenge would make me look too much like them," she said. Arthur's eyes filled with a tired gratitude that made her look away first. In the great room, Margaret turned another page. Ethan shifted his weight, impatient now. Vanessa checked the faces around her, confirming that nothing had changed yet. But Grace saw Margaret's hand move to the thicker section of the will, the part tied with a narrow blue ribbon. Arthur had chosen that ribbon himself. Grace remembered because his fingers had struggled with the knot, and she had offered to help. He refused gently. "Some things," he said, "a man must finish with his own hands." The blue ribbon carried Grace back to the morning Arthur signed the final papers. A cold March morning when frost still held the grass around the lake, and the house was quiet enough for every sound to matter. Margaret Hale had arrived before sunrise with 2 witnesses from her Stanford office, both dressed in dark wool coats, both speaking with the careful gentleness people use around a dying man who is still fully in command of his mind. Arthur refused to sign in bed. He asked Grace to open the curtains, straighten the books on his desk, and bring him the navy robe Clara hated because it made him look less like a chairman and more like someone's grandfather. Grace had tied the belt loosely while he stood by the window, looking across the frozen lawn toward the dock. "Ethan thinks legacy is a house," he said. He never understood it is the reason you refused to sell one. On the desk lay the documents Ethan had not known existed. The amended will, the trust revisions, the foundation control agreement, and a temporary governance order for Whitmore Holdings. Each page had been drafted with the calm precision of a door closing without noise. Arthur did not leave Grace a sentimental token. He left her responsibility. He transferred voting control of the Whitmore Foundation to her for a minimum of 18 months. He placed the lake house in a protected trust she would supervise. He granted her authority to pause any sale of family property until all financial records had been reviewed by an independent audit committee. And then came the clause Margaret had read twice aloud because even Grace had gone still when she heard it. If irregular spending, undisclosed debt, or misuse of charitable funds were discovered, Grace would serve as interim chair of Whitmore Holdings until the board completed its investigation. Grace had looked at Arthur then, not with triumph, but with concern. "Arthur, they will say I planned this." He smiled faintly, his hand resting beside the pen. "People who cannot imagine loyalty will always call it strategy." Margaret placed the signature page in front of him. Arthur's fingers trembled, but his eyes did not. He signed his name slowly, every letter dark against the cream paper, then waited while the witnesses signed beneath him. Grace stood near the bookshelf, arms folded lightly across her coat, feeling the strange weight of being trusted by a man whose own blood had mistaken her quiet for emptiness. When it was done, Arthur asked everyone to leave except her. Margaret hesitated, then stepped into the hallway and closed the door. The fire clicked softly behind the grate. Arthur reached into the desk drawer and took out the folded handkerchief he had carried for years. "When this is read," he said, placing it in her palm, "they will look at you as if you stole something." Grace shook her head. "I do not want your house." "I know," he said. "That is why you can be trusted not to destroy it." Back in the great room, the same handkerchief rested in Grace's lap as Margaret untied the blue ribbon. Ethan's confidence had begun to thin around the edges. Vanessa no longer looked bored. Clara leaned forward, her tissue forgotten in her hand. The mahogany table held the envelope, the will, and the silence of a man who had arranged his final words carefully. Margaret lifted the first page of the revised section, and for the first time since Grace entered the house, Ethan stopped smiling before anyone had taken anything from him. Margaret had only read the first line of the revised section when Ethan stepped forward as if a legal document were just another room he could enter without permission. "Before this goes any further," he said, and the tone was smooth enough to sound reasonable to anyone who did not know the old shape of his pride. Margaret paused with the page lifted in both hands. The rain tapped the windows in a steady rhythm, soft as fingers waiting outside the glass. Ethan looked around the great room, taking in the relatives, the framed photograph, the silver trays of untouched coffee, the staff standing near the hall with their eyes lowered. He had always known how to use an audience. "My father was ill for a long time," he said. His judgment at the end was often guided by emotion. We all know how vulnerable he became to certain attachments. He did not say Grace's name. He did not have to. Vanessa lowered her chin, hiding the faintest smile. Clara looked uncertain, but not enough to stop him. Grace sat in the back row with Arthur's handkerchief resting across her palms. She did not move. She had learned that people who are desperate to own a room often reveal more than anyone asks them to. Ethan turned toward Margaret. "The foundation needs modern leadership. The lake house is no longer practical. Maintaining 12,000 square feet for the sake of memory is not legacy. It is waste." A cousin near the piano nodded before realizing no one else had. Ethan continued, encouraged by his own voice. "I have already spoken with advisors about selling the property, restructuring the foundation, and moving Whitmore Holdings into a more efficient era. My father built something remarkable, but sentiment cannot be allowed to bury good business." At the word sentiment, Grace felt the handkerchief beneath her fingers and remembered Arthur standing by the frozen window, tying a blue ribbon with trembling hands. Margaret's expression did not change, but her eyes sharpened behind her glasses. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "your father anticipated that possibility." Ethan gave a short laugh. "Of course he did. My father anticipated everything except betrayal dressed as devotion." The sentence crossed the room and settled at Grace's feet. This time, even Vanessa looked at him, perhaps sensing that elegance had slipped into something too exposed. The housekeeper's eyes lifted for half a second, then dropped again. Grace finally stood. No chair scraped. No dramatic breath passed through the room. She rose slowly, smoothing the front of her black coat, the old handkerchief still folded in one hand. Ethan turned to her with a satisfied look, as if he had at last pulled a reaction from the woman he had tried to shrink for years. "You want to say something now?" he asked. Grace looked at him, then at Arthur's photograph above the fireplace. Her voice, when it came, was quiet enough that everyone had to listen. "I was asked to be here. That was all. No defense. No accusation. No attempt to explain the nights, the paperwork, the hospital coffee, the winter calls, the small apartment above the bakery, or the dignity Ethan had mistaken for defeat. Just one sentence, placed gently into the room like a glass set down without spilling." Ethan's face tightened. "Then listen," he said. Margaret lowered the page slightly. "That is exactly what your father requested," she replied. She turned back to the document and rested one finger on the next line. The blue ribbon lay open beside the envelope now, a thin strip of color against the polished mahogany. Every person in the room leaned toward the will. Ethan stood beneath his father's portrait, still believing he was waiting to inherit. Grace remained standing in the back, holding the only thing Arthur had given her before the papers were read. Then Margaret drew a breath, and the next words changed the temperature of the room. Margaret read the next sentence without raising her voice, and that was what made it devastating. "I appoint Grace Eleanor Whitmore as sole acting trustee of the Whitmore Foundation for a period of no less than 18 months, with full authority to review, suspend, or approve all grants, transfers, consulting agreements, and administrative expenditures made in the Foundation's name." For 1 second, no one understood the words because everyone understood them too well. The room stayed perfectly still. Ethan's face did not change at first. His expression simply lost its warmth, the way a window loses sunlight when a cloud passes over it. Vanessa's hand, still resting on his sleeve, became very still. Clara looked from Margaret to Grace as if the back row had suddenly moved closer without making a sound. Margaret turned the page. The paper made a clean, dry sound against her fingers. "The Lake House property, including the main residence, adjoining acreage, dock, boathouse, and all historical contents not otherwise assigned, shall be placed under the Preservation Trust supervised by Grace Eleanor Whitmore. No sale, transfer, mortgage, or redevelopment of said property shall be permitted without her written consent." Ethan took one step forward. "That is not possible." Margaret did not look up immediately. She finished the sentence first, then adjusted her glasses. "It is signed, witnessed, notarized, and filed according to Connecticut law." The words landed with the weight Ethan had always pretended belonged only to him. Grace remained standing in the back row, Arthur's handkerchief folded in one hand, her eyes lowered to the rug. She could feel the room turning toward her, not with kindness yet, but with calculation, astonishment, and the beginning of fear. Ethan gave a tight smile, the kind used at board tables when panic needed to wear a suit. "My father would never hand family control to someone outside the family." Margaret reached into the folder and removed a second document, thicker than the first, bound with a black clip. "Your father addressed that as well." Vanessa's fingers slipped from Ethan's sleeve. It was a small movement, almost nothing, but Grace saw it. So did Ethan. Margaret continued. "In the event of irregular spending, undisclosed liabilities, or misuse of charitable funds connected to Whitmore Foundation accounts, Grace Eleanor Whitmore shall assume the position of interim chair of Whitmore Holdings until an independent audit committee has completed its review." A low sound moved through the relatives, not a gasp exactly, more like the room taking one breath at the same time. Ethan looked at the document now instead of Margaret. As if paper had become an enemy, he could not interrupt. Clara whispered his name, but he did not answer. Margaret placed another sealed packet on the table. "Your father included supporting records for the board. Reimbursement approvals, advisory memos, duplicate consulting payments, and proposed property sale documents." Vanessa's diamond no longer flashed. Her hand had fallen to her side. Ethan turned toward Grace, and for the first time that afternoon, there was no performance in his face. Only recognition. Not of love, not of regret. Recognition that she had been in the room long before he noticed her. Grace did not smile. She did not step forward. She did not rescue him from the silence he had created. Margaret lifted the final letter, written in Arthur's uneven hand, and read the line he had left for the whole family to hear. My son inherited my name. Grace inherited my trust. The mantel clock ticked once. Outside, rain traced the windows in silver threads. Inside, Ethan stood beneath his father's portrait with nothing left to sell, while Grace held an old handkerchief and said nothing at all. The room did not erupt. That was the strange cruelty of it. No one shouted. No one crossed the floor. No one knocked over a glass or demanded that the dead explain himself. The Whitmores were too well trained for that. Their shock stayed expensive, held behind. Pressed lips, stiff shoulders, and hands that forgot what they were holding. Ethan stood beneath Arthur's portrait with the color drained from his face, staring at the documents as if the ink might rearrange itself out of respect for him. Margaret Hale placed Arthur's final letter beside the will, aligned the pages with quiet precision, and slid a pen toward Grace. Mrs. Whitmore, she said, your acknowledgement is required here, here, and here. For a moment, the old name moved through the room like a match struck in darkness. Grace walked forward from the back row. Every step felt longer than the 20 feet between the chairs and the mahogany table. She passed the relatives who had laughed. She passed the housekeeper whose eyes shone with restrained relief. She passed Clara, who looked at Grace not as a daughter-in-law, not as an outsider, but as a woman she had underestimated for years and could no longer afford to misunderstand. Vanessa took one step away from Ethan. It was quiet, almost graceful, but it told the whole room what loyalty looked like when it had been purchased with comfort. Grace reached the table and looked down at Arthur's signature. The letters trembled near the end, but they were complete. He had finished what he promised. Margaret handed her the pen. Grace signed once for the foundation, once for the preservation trust, and once for the temporary authority Arthur had placed in her hands. The pen moved smoothly across the paper. No flourish, no hesitation, no revenge hidden in the shape of her name. Ethan finally spoke, his voice lower now, stripped of the polished amusement he had worn at the beginning. Grace, he said, and the sound of her name from his mouth felt late, like a train arriving after the station had closed. She capped the pen before she looked at him. You could have told me, he said. There it was, not an apology, not yet, only the first instinct of a man who thought even silence should have reported to him. Grace folded Arthur's handkerchief once more, then placed it gently beside the will. Arthur asked me to protect what mattered, she said. Ethan's jaw moved, but no answer came. Outside, the rain had softened into a mist, silvering the long windows and blurring the dock beyond the lawn. Margaret closed the folder of supporting records. The board will be notified by morning, she said. Until then, no property transactions, no foundation transfers, and no public statements without trustee approval. The words settled over Ethan like locks turning one after another. Grace picked up her coat from the chair. Clara whispered her name, but Grace did not stop. There was nothing cruel in the way she left them. That was what made it unbearable. She did not look victorious. She looked free. At the front doors, the housekeeper stepped forward and opened one side for her. Cool air entered the foyer, carrying the smell of wet stone, pine trees, and the lake. Grace stepped onto the porch, where a reporter waiting beyond the drive called out, Mrs. Whitmore, do you feel like you won today? Grace paused beneath the shelter of the overhang. Behind her, through the tall windows, Ethan remained frozen in the room he thought he owned. She looked toward the lake, toward the dark line of the dock Arthur had refused to let become another number in a ledger. Then she answered softly, No, I only stopped letting them call my silence weakness. And with that, Grace walked down the stone steps into the rain, leaving the house lit behind her like a past that could no longer follow.